Good afternoon. Hi, my name's Jane Dugan, and I'm a member of the Sophomore Leadership Program. We're delighted to welcome Sister Jane Morrissey to Elms College today to help us celebrate National Catholic Sisters Week, as Sister Jane offers her thoughts on her contributions to the book Unruly Catholic Nuns. National Catholic Sisters Week, held in conjunction with Women's History Month, is celebrated this week across the country. Created to honor women religious, it is a series of events in various locations that instruct, enlighten, and bring greater focus to the lives of these incredible women. It's our chance to recognize all that they have done for us. Sister Jane graduated from Elms College in 1962. 1962, and went on to receive an MA and a Ph.D. from the University of Massachusetts. Sister Jane Morrissey served as president of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Springfield from 1999 to 2005. Prior to her leadership in the congregation, she was a pastoral minister at the Blessed Sacrament Parish in Springfield, director of the SSJ Office for Peace and Justice, a founding member, and a board member at the Gray House, and a teacher at Elms College and Cathedral High School. Sister Jane has been a crusader for peace, an author and scholar, and a teacher for more than 40 years. She currently works at Homework House of the Hermano Pedro in Holyoke, which she co-founded in 2006, and has devoted many years to working with the poor in Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Guatemala. She has received many awards for her community involvement and work on behalf of peace, including the New England Peace Award from the New England Catholic Peace Fellowship, the Massachusetts Pax Christi Peacemaker Award, an award from the Mental Health Consortium of Greater Springfield for volunteer service, the William Pynchon Award for community service, and the Pioneer Valley Notre Dame Club Exemplar Award for service to church. In 2007, Elms College awarded Sister Jane Morrissey an honorary degree. When those of us in the Sophomore Leadership Program met with Sister Jane last month to plan today's event, we were struck by how much Sister Jane has done in her lifetime. She's an example to all of us to continue to speak up for social justice. She reminded us to always feel free to be unruly and that each one of us makes a difference every day. We are confident that today's event with Sister Jane will inspire each person to present to consider how they too can be unruly in speaking out for justice. Welcome, Sister Jane.
I just want to begin by telling you two things. One, when I was a sophomore here at the Elms, and I was telling the sophomore leadership team about this experience, there was a note on the bulletin board summoning me to the office of a sister of St. Joseph who was in the English department here. And she gave me, I think, the most important advice I've received in my life. There were all kinds of pressures on me from my family, above all, to major in science and math because those were my best subjects. In my heart, I wanted to major in English. She told me to follow my heart. And that's how my education opened up to the whole world. Part of that education introduced me also to an essay written here in Massachusetts in the early 19th century by Henry David Thoreau. I read a quotation from him this morning that said something like this: "The path to freedom begins with disobedience. The obedient are already enslaved." So, we all have choices in our lives, and somehow these choices have taken me on this unruly path. And what I am going to do right now, having said those two things by way of introduction, is read to you from an essay I was prompted to write the year that Eileen Kirk was a freshman at the Elms, and I was a novice college teacher at the Elms. And so Eileen and I met. I want, having said her name out loud, to thank every one of you here, some of whom I only met this morning, some of whom I met early this afternoon, some of whom I met as long ago as in the 1960s when I went to teach at Cathedral High School. To all of you, however you got here, for whatever reason, may I just say, I love you. And so I begin an essay that I started to write because that same year I met Eileen, there was a student who sat at a desk up on the third floor in this building, always in the same seat. I never had her in class, but she went on to become a sister of St. Joseph, and she wrote to me about 5 or 6 years ago and said to me, "There's a call for papers, and you need to write something. There's a book coming out about unruly nuns." The something I wrote was due 4 days later, so I couldn't give too much time worrying or considering it. I decided I ought to obey her, and I wrote something that is now in print in this book. Been drafted, redrafted, but not changed in a lot of ways, except that my life has gone on, so for 6 years I've done other things I haven't had a chance to write about. All right. This is the start of the essay. Unruly? Who says? Who sets the rules, puts in parentheses, chooses capital letters? The Church of Trent, or Vatican I, or Vatican II, or the Vatican? Or those who stand up for the gospel of Jesus Christ and are willing to lay down their lives for just that. Or a little of all this and that, responding to the signs of the times from the margins of the newsprint and the neighborhood and the barrio, and protesting the wings of whatever drones come in surveillance with instruments of violence. Who says? I ask from where I sit at the computer, composed and composing in a gray house to which I was called by to whom it does concern, by that very church that called action on behalf of justice a constituent element of evangelization. Now I go to 1976. Under a heavy yoke of obedience to a leadership team that denied me permission to teach at Pine Ridge Reservation, I went instead to teach at the College of Our Lady of the Elms in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and was granted permission by that same leadership team to live off campus when almost everybody lived here who was a sister of St. Joseph, in a poor neighborhood nearby. That lessened the weight of that yoke of teaching some. That permission became the gate through which Sister Mary Dooley, congregational president through the post-Vatican Extraordinary Chapter, released me to engage in postdoctoral study called La Vida in the unruly world of the north end of Springfield, Massachusetts. Mary did understand and stand for something new. Through the 1970s, she was working with Sisters Joan Chittister, Joan Doyle, and Teresa Kane at the Unruly Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which still remains under the Vatican microscope. It was she, Mary, who had introduced me to the church in the modern world, and other documents written by the experts she met when earning her Ph.D. at the Sorbonne, where she had heard the 60s protest in Paris, "Be reasonable, do the impossible." In the 70s, Sister Mary Dooley had flown on Air Force One with Vice President Walter Mondale to the installations of Popes John Paul I and II. It was she who said in the tumult of change, when I was penned up at the Mother House without newspapers, that we young nuns should show up and pay attention to the Catholic Peace Fellowship, gathering from our New England states at Mount Marie by then keynote speaker Gordon Zahn, who had uncovered brave Austrian Franz Jägerstätter in solitary witness. Franz Jägerstätter, I will tell you, was an Austrian peasant, a devout Catholic, who was killed by Adolf Hitler and his cohort of leadership in Nazi Germany. Late that morning of the fellowship gathering, someone in blue jeans told me to get in line. Now, getting in line meant going to a protest. It was my first experience of that. We went to some little market in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and I was totally free to say no to buying Gallo wine, which was produced by farm workers, still enslaved by some of the laws and some of the practices at farms from here to California. All right. I would then teach at the Elms by day and live among the poor by night and see outside of school el barrio de mi vida, the neighborhood for my life. Christmas vacation there taught me how the homeless huddled in the basement laundry near dryers, their fireside. I began to understand what it is to live between fear and love on Sheldon Street and share my struggle in prayer with the one who matters more and more. So I lived in the North End, and I began to see things I had never seen before. I began to hear a heart beating inside me that was different from the one that was in the tunes of the silence of my mother house or even my own home in which I grew up in Westfield. And then I kept listening and listening. We bought a gray house on Sheldon Street for $500, a 17-room house damaged by fire. We were 5 nuns, Sisters of St. Joseph, living there then, and they taught me so much about what it is to be poor, what it is to be distracted by the rights of those who have in the world in which so many have not. I considered the question of human rights and began to know that I needed experiences beyond the North End in order to understand the worlds that so many of my neighbors had come from. And then one night, something happened. Penny Lernoux, herself a widely respected journalist on Latin America, born here in the United States, came, and here I will resume reading from my essay, came to speak at the Elms on human rights in Latin America, and she stayed with us at the Gray House. She said, as do the people of my neighborhood in the North End, "Mi casa es tu casa." But she lived far away. She lived in the worlds they had left behind. In response, I went with students to her home in Bogota. Then and there I learned what a snob I was. Still am in some ways. I said to a woman in a homeless shelter hunched over an indecipherable paper that I couldn't read her writing, only to be humbled in tears when I listened as staff there explained what a struggle it had been to get her to have the courage to dare hold a writing implement in her hand. Penny introduced me to the world of Latin America. The majority of my neighbors in the North End still speak Spanish as their native language. More and more of them come from Central America and from Mexico. I began to wonder about the worlds that they live in, there and beyond. I had the opportunities to travel to some of those countries, to begin to do scholarship there. I began to think about the wars and the policies of my country here that caused so many there to flee for safety to these shores. I began to know the blame and the shame of the violators of human rights as a member of this country, and I began to think about the consequences. Again, I read from the book. On the eve of Martin Luther King Day, snow covered the ground at the gates of Westover Air Force Base, and I was taken by van to the Chicopee Police Station. There, about 70 of us stood in a circle in the station basement. Slowly, everyone joined in the Taizé chant. Ubi caritas et amor. Ubi caritas Deus ibi est. Where there is love, there is God. God is there. Among those 70 plus arrested were a sister of Notre Dame and I. Hattie, the seasoned protest organizer and herself a good Jewish mother from the Buddhist Peace Pagoda, asked the two of us sisters to be the last processed. We agreed. Sister Julie and I somehow believed that we two sisters, or she, Hattie, believed that we two sisters had the power to stay and stop any hand raised in violence. At the last, Hattie, Sister Julie, and I, we three were locked up with one juvenile, a Quaker high school student from Providence, in a broom closet with shelves that became our beds. We went to court the next day and then again for another hearing. The courts decided to leave our arrest on the books, quote, without a finding, unquote. In February, I went to those gates again, wearing a black scarf in solidarity with the grieving women of Iraq. and was remanded to the same court file. My work at this stage in my life, when I had left the Elms campus, in the Office for Justice and Peace, as Jane reminded us, was coupled with continuing study of languages in Guatemala. I had wanted to converse more effectively with my neighbors. Some grace had seized me when my heart leapt out of my body before the interred bones of Hermano Pedro de San Jose Betancourt in the little village of Antigua, Guatemala. I felt impelled to learn more Spanish and an indigenous language, Caxiquel, so that I could collect stories there from both Mayan and Ladino narrators with Cristina Canales, my Cuban colleague at the Elms, now herself so frail and helpless in Puerto Rico with a brain tumor. Please keep her and her cousin Elsa, who cares for her daily, in your prayers. I'd always wanted to write a book. I didn't expect to write this book, a trilingual anthology of Guatemalan oral tradition, but I did. It was a fit with my doctoral studies in stories and oral tradition, and the life went on. I went from the Office for Justice and Peace, as Jane told you, to working in my parish in the North End. Then I got to know violence firsthand. I got to understand it. In the years I worked in my parish, 12 children, really, under the age of, one of them was 21, she was the oldest, the youngest might have been 8 years old, died of gun violence in the city of Springfield. And sometimes the person responsible for the violence, as well as the victim, were members of my parish. I began to understand more about the complexity of evil and violence close to home and wondered where peace continued to call me. At the time of this next excerpt, another Bush was in the White House, and I was president of my community. I had an obligation not only to the poor, to peace, but also to my community. It was one thing for me to be arrested before I became president of my community, but what was I going to do afterward as president of my community? The next passage the sophomores chose is this one. When the second President Bush started escalating the call for war in Iraq, I went to Washington in new shoes as president and in the name of the community. When war broke, I knew not what to do until the day arrived when I asked our leadership team, and I want to express my gratitude to that team, Maureen, Kathy, who's now with God, Patty, and Fran White, whom some of you mentioned this morning. I asked them if they would support me. They said yes and encouraged me to ask the entire community. And 90% of my sisters said yes to my representing them. After breaking bread on the day United States troops entered Baghdad, I was arrested in front of the federal building in Springfield. Many of the arresting officers had been my students in the 1990s during a one-semester course that Mary Dooley seduced me to teach, called The Gospel Imperative for Justice and Peace. It was part of Anna Maria College's criminal justice program. One of those officers whom I had taught was there when I was handcuffed and put in the van. He was the one who persuaded the matron to serve us supper in the cells in which we were held in the Springfield police station. For the first time since elementary school, I ate bologna on dry corn's white sandwich bread. Our cells were cold. Oh, and those metal beds were colder. But the men on one side of the cell block and the women on the other were singing, as we did in that Chicopee police station. This time, we were singing together, all of us in parts. This time, the case went to trial. A Quaker lawyer from Northampton offered us his services. I became the spokesperson for the band of arrestees. We learned in court from films viewed by the judge that national security posted armed agents on the roofs of the buildings surrounding us in downtown Springfield as the snow gracefully flurried on our shoulders. We had resisted orders. We had continued to kneel and pray for peace. When I spoke before the judge in the courtroom that day, I quoted the preamble to the Constitution, which I had memorized as the consequence of some classroom misbehavior in Sister Joseph Paul's 7th grade at St. Mary's School in Westfield. Richard, my lawyer brother, I'm one of a family of 7. I have 5 sisters and 1 brother, and poor Richard, who taught me something about how hard it is to be a minority. I never thought of that until just now. Ed McDonough, you can tell him that. Richard, at St. Mary's School, Richard, my lawyer brother, advised me to include in our defense reference to Article 14 of our Massachusetts Constitution, granting freedom and rights to citizens for expressing legitimate grievance. We were all found not guilty. The finding echoed a conversation I had the morning after this arrest at Mount Marie Healthcare Center, at the bedside of a sister still dear to me, Sister Helen Bernard, who was directress of novices in my time, who told me she was mortally embarrassed the first time I was arrested. Did I really have to do that? Well, there she was on what was to prove her deathbed. And the morning after my arrest, when my picture was again on the front page of the paper, I went in to tell her I was going to court that morning. And she said, "Jane, I saw the morning paper. Were it not for my condition, I would have been at your side." Now I tell you quickly, children have become my life. Poor children, I learn more from them day after day. I still live at the Gray House. We have founded Homework House in Holyoke, where so many of your Elms students, one alum who just celebrated his 30th birthday, Andrew Melendez told me yesterday, came for a visit with his 2 little daughters. You've been so helpful there, and I just ask you to continue to be. But there I was called to God, by God, to the children I've come to love. Since we founded Homework House in 2006, I've been working there. I have to admit I haven't gotten arrested, and I think sometimes it's because I can't imagine a day in my life without those Homework House children. But let me tell you this, and this is the conclusion of my essay. In the 2nd decade of life, as Sister Jane, the unruly life I yet enjoy began with its own brand of half-blind obedience. It led me to a neighborhood that introduced me to a world I would not otherwise know. The more I learned, the further I went into that document of Vatican II, the Church in the Modern World. In this gray house where I composed this essay, in the morning, sometimes throughout the day, we gather as Sisters of St. Joseph. We sit in the quiet of the turret at the top of the house and look out at our world. We listen to the Word of God. We share prayer. And as the sun is rising, we go out and do what we do. Then, at the close of the day, we pray again, sleep, and dream toward tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Jane, for your wonderful words of inspiration. I'm sure that every person here is walking away with renewed commitment to work alongside our dear neighbor. At this time, we'd like to open the floor to any questions or comments you may have.
Sister Jane, thank you so much. I was struck first when I read your essay last month, and then again today, how much the Sisters of St. Joseph have been pioneers for all of us. You know, when you spoke about Mary Dooley, you know, giving you permission to do what was in your heart, and the many, many things that you have done over the years. You know, little did I know when I was your student in 1976, the impact that you would have on my life. I remember as a student being encouraged by the Sisters of St. Joseph to boycott the grapes, and we did it back then. And there have been touch points since 1976, and you have been a part of those touch points for me and for my family. So thank you for following your heart and for all you do for this community, because those of us who have known you through the years, I would venture to say that there's not one of us who has not been touched deeply by what you have done. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Just thank you for everything you've done for me and everyone in this room, but I was just curious. The judge who found you not guilty, do you remember who that judge was?
Well, I'll tell you a few things, Judge McDonough. It was so funny because, you know, as Judge McDonough may know, and you wouldn't know this, but my family has been part of the legal law-abiding community in Western Massachusetts since the early 20th century. All right. So my grandfather was a lawyer. He was a criminal lawyer. My father was a clerk of courts over in the city of Westfield and practiced law himself, mainly for the poor. My brother has been clerk of courts in Springfield until fairly recently, and still practices law. And he is kind enough to, when he was clerk of courts, he could only take on cases for family members. That was part of the rule to keep you objective. And so he would tell me when I would go telling him another story for one of my dear neighbors in the North End, "They're your family, Jane. I'll see what I can do to help them out," you know, and always came through. So, all right, why do I say that by way of introduction? For you who wouldn't know, I really have had a lot to do with the courts myself, and not only because I've been arrested. I've volunteered at the jail. So there are people in that community who know me. And so they had to bring down a judge from the Berkshires to find someone who didn't feel like he was already on our side. And I do know I wrote him a thank you note, but maybe by grace at this moment, I can't think of his name, Ed, but my brother probably can, and it was my only encounter with him. He's himself retired right now, but he was wonderful. And when they showed this video that was taken by somebody who works on films on peace and peacemaking, when he saw the federal agents from national security there with their arms pointed on this group of we were about 20 that day, kneeling and praying at the doors of the federal courthouse. He knew something about our purpose that touched him to the heart. He was himself by faith Jewish, so he knows what the Holocaust cost all of human history in violence by calling out blind obedience that is sometimes, I think, in this country, parading as patriotism. And he found us not guilty. And that was so much better than being without a finding on the books, So I'm not innocent by any means, but I will do what I have to the day I die for peace. And I will follow my heart. Thanks for asking.
Sounds like Fred Rutberg might have been your judge.
You might be right.
Okay.
You might be right.
I'm sure he was doing his best to be impartial, but it kind of sounds like the fix was in.
I remember one of the judges I had to go before was the Haitian judge. This was at the hearings before the trial, and yep, and he was so wonderful, but he had to recuse himself too from hearing the case. So I felt I don't go through life even wanting to feel powerful, but when you're clothed in the power of grace, and it's an armor that nothing can penetrate. Follow your heart. Anyway.
Sister Jane.
Yes, go ahead.
Sister Jane, thank you for the story, the beautiful prose, and the heart full of love that exudes from your telling the story. To be arrested not more than once certainly takes courage, but also some clarity, some sense of clarity about what is right. For the young people in the audience, and not the not so young, so sometimes who may be struggle with figuring out what is the right thing to do. How did you always know, with that sense of clarity, what is the right thing to do and to disobey laws that may have been unjust?
Thank you for asking that question, because I remember one time in my life when this expression came to me, and it was just before being asked a comparable question that had to do with another arrest that I didn't read to you about, but do you understand this expression I'm going to use, because it's the only one I can think of, again, still. Do you know when something goes clunk in your heart? And sometimes, I say it goes clunk because it's heavy. It may be not only at odds with what I have in my head and what is being said by those around me, but it's heavy. It's going to have a cost. but you see somehow behind the clunk you feel the light of truth. The title for my essay involves the words of Jesus, "The truth shall set you free." When you know you can lay down your life, lay down your thoughts, lay down your body, the only one you have, for what you believe, no matter what anybody's saying, no matter what your own head may tell you, then I think you have the clarity. And if you're not quiet, you're not going to hear it happen. And that's why I think we have such a treasure in prayer, in quiet prayer that calls us where no one else can go. And at the same time, I must say, in the heritage that belongs to us in the sacred word, whether the sacred word for you is the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or the Hebrew scriptures or the Christian scriptures, there are voices there, there are people there, and there is a company there, a communion of saints that has been through this all before you, and that will stay with you if you say, no matter what, I don't know a lot of things, but I know this is what I have to do when I get up tomorrow morning. And sometimes it's long in coming, but let me tell you, it is worth waiting for and living for. So thank you, Dr. Dumais. That is all I humbly have to offer as the answer I've found in my life, which is all I have after all. Yes? Please.
I just want to say this because I don't think I've ever said this in front of you. You certainly have encouraged me in my life to be someone who would speak out no matter what. And I remember when you were president, and I spoke out verbally against the church. It was very well out there. And I got a call from Dan Rather, and he said, will you go on 60 Minutes with me and say what you're saying? And I remember Sister Betty Browen at the time said, you know, it won't be difficult. Jane is the president. And how many times has she been arrested and spoke out when she should have closed her mouth? So you go. So I went up, and I just looked at her, and I said, this is coming out. And all she did was just open her eyes big and look at me, like I was going to say, don't do it. I helped you with the turret in the North End. I was with you so many times, Guatemala, etc. I said, she's not going to say anything to me. So I was never nervous to speak out.
Thank you, Mary. And you know, I want publicly to thank my whole community of St. Joseph, you know, vowed sisters, associates, agrégés, you who are all of you partners in mission. And in this National Sisters Week, you know, it's wonderful to know it's being commemorated here at the Elms. It's such a privilege to be a part of it. I remember telling the sophomore leadership team when we had lunch on the same day that Judge McDonough became the kind of judge he is now in the state of Massachusetts. And I was with him in the morning, and I came up here, and I told him, like, among the stories in this book of Unruly Nuns are the stories of sisters who lived as vowed religious for a while and left. some of them who have found great freedom where they are, all of them who have their own burdens where they are, some of whom carry burdens from when they were sisters because of misunderstanding. But among them is the beautiful story of the daughter of Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's a one-page poem about Rose Hawthorne. And Rose Hawthorne was married to a very active alcoholic in New York City. There's a biography of hers that's more telling perhaps than this one page, but the biography is entitled "Sorrow Built a Bridge." And there is a kind of sorrow that comes to you with fidelity to the gospel, as well as a kind of unquenchable joy. And her husband died as a consequence of his alcoholism, and she had become a Catholic because he was a Catholic. And she founded the Dominican Sisters of the Sick Poor. And her community is still among those who are actively caring, specifically in Atlanta, Georgia, for children with cancer, children who are dying of cancer, children whose cancer is unmistakably fatal, who would get no care. These are brave women, and I could not name all the brave women who have walked before me, but we have a couple of them who are members of our community in a conspicuous way here in our midst, and those who are members of our community in a quieter way, perhaps not known to everyone, but to all of you who are members of my community of Sisters of St. Joseph, I thank you. And I work in a place called Homework House. I thank you for what you do at home. I thank you for the work you do. And I thank you for the houses you visit with the compassion of Jesus Christ. May it always be thus. We have a long road to go on, but as the children, the high school children, are telling our nation now, we'd better go that way, and we'd better be willing to risk to do it.
Thank you, Sister Jane, again for your presence here today. We will now take a minute to draw names for the book raffle. Stephanie will draw your names, and we will bring the book to you.
Elena D. Ed McDonough. Jacqueline Luna. Caitlin Smith. Mary J. I don't know how to
Jameson.
Mary Lou Sicard. Regina T. Dan C. Kyle Andrick. This is the last one. And Abby Smith.
Congratulations to all our book winners, and a final thank you for all of you here for attending our event today. We hope that you enjoyed our event, and we would like to thank the campus ministry for sponsoring this event, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.